This is Have News, Will Read, and I'm Will. The media landscape is filled with garbage, and I'm not just talking about CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, but also other respectable so-called straight news sources. It is next to impossible to get unbiased news, and I won't promise you'll get that from me either. But what I can give you is a breakdown of disingenuous reporting, and I can tell you how the article slants the story. Sometimes the slant is explicit, many times it's subtle. But each episode, I'll dive into one of those trusted resources and dig out the valuable story you want with as little of the reporter's bias as possible. This week, we'll take a look at the Reuters article titled Texas Threatens to Become the Next Flashpoint on Voting Rules. Now, the gist of the article is that American Airlines released a public statement strongly opposing the bill that would change some of Texas's voting rules from the 2020 election. The article then recaps a similar situation involving Delta opposing a Georgia bill. So there you go. I saved you 2 minutes and 45 seconds of reading. So why is this article so bad? Well, one, the title is vague and doesn't acknowledge the main subject of the article. Two, half the article doesn't have to do with the Texas situation at all, which in itself wouldn't be an issue if it wasn't for, number three, the article lacks links and details on the situation in Texas. It even goes so far as to make a significant claim, but only offers the most superficial of evidence for it. So there's definitely room to expand on it. Number four, and finally, it is biased by repeatedly characterizing the bill in a way that favors the bill's opponent's characterization of it. They barely acknowledge the fact that this bill can be characterized in another way. So let's go back to the title. Now, to me, a title foreshadows what the story is going to be about, and I think this title is disingenuous. It says, Texas threatens to become the next flashpoint on voting rules. The title is very vague, and is only written in this way, I think, to inform the reader that there is a controversy with the voting rules. If you asked me, though, to guess as to who would be involved in this controversy, my first guess definitely would have been Republican and Democrat state lawmakers are probably battling it out with public statements. This article has none of that. If you gave me a second guess, I would have think that maybe lawyers have started to prepare to challenge the voting rules in court. Again, this article has none of that. I definitely would not have guessed that this article is about an airline making a public statement opposing the law. Like, who would have guessed that based on the title? I would argue that a more accurate, appropriate headline would have been something like Airline Company voices opposition to Texas voting bill. Of course, this title is just to the point. But if you have that title, it's not as juicy, I guess. And it would probably trigger the next question of, so what? Like, what does an airline have to do with the voting bill? Like, why is this news? Are they part of the voting process? No. Are people taking planes to their local voting places? Unlikely. This is a controversy about a random corporate company releasing a public statement about a bill that only in the loosest sense involves them. And it begs the question, is this then even news? I don't know. I mean, I guess everything is news if you want it to be. But I do know that the first source of bias begins with the decision on what and what not to report. And I look at this story and I say a reporter made a decision to amplify a corporate public relations statement as news. And they characterize it as a sign of a significant controversy surrounding this bill. So for issues 2 and 3, I'm going to acknowledge them in tandem because they're definitely interrelated. Having half of your article not dealing with the main subject of Texas and the airline specifically isn't really an issue if it weren't for the lack of details they chose to leave out in favor of tying the whole situation with the one in Georgia. Now, I get it. The parallel to the Georgia situation makes sense, and it's obvious. Airline criticizes state government about voting bill. But that doesn't really excuse leaving out relevant details regarding the Texas situation, and I think there are some significant details being left out. The article only briefly identifies 3 changes. 1, the bill will eliminate drive-through voting. 2, they will limit the polling site hours. And 3, it will give partisan poll watchers more autonomy. The article does not spend any space explaining the detail of what limiting hours is going to look like, what autonomy means. They don't even provide a link to another story that would do it for them. They just mention these 3 changes, present them on face value as voting restrictions, and move on. Now, are they voting restrictions? Maybe. I know one side would say they're voting restrictions, but the article doesn't explain what that argument would be. They just are voting restrictions. If you think knowing more about these changes would kind of determine whether you'd view these as voting restrictions versus, say, I don't know, election integrity changes, as another side might say they are, you need to go outside of this article. So, what does limiting the polling site hours means? It means you can no longer in Texas early vote 24 hours a day, as was done in 2020. You now vote between the hours of 6 a.m. and 9 p.m., which is 15 hours a day. So you lost 9 hours. You can no longer vote from the hours of 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. I would be interested to know how many people voted during those 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. hours, but again, that was also not in the other article that I found. It amends the election code to require voting to happen inside a permanent building. So this is how they're eliminating voting from your car in Texas. However, Texans, even though they're not allowed to vote for the car anymore, if they're unable to enter a polling place because of a health risk, then they can vote from their car. So I'm not even sure it's appropriate to say that they've eliminated it if there's an exception for it. So both of these changes, though, are said to be aimed at accommodating poll watchers' ability to monitor the vote. But it's interesting that none of this characterization from the other side, the election integrity side, is included in this article. And I think this just shows what is going to go into our next point, that the article is heavily biased towards one side. So one of the things, the first thing I want to point out that shows this biasness is that it provides one significant statement that I think heavily influences the prism you view this news through. And that's when it states the state already has some of the most stringent voting laws in the country, according to election experts. Now, that's all that's said about it. You have to, on face value, just take it as fact that Texas has some of the most stringent voting laws in the country. You don't know by which measure that is, like who's measuring it. All you know is that according to election experts have said that. They don't even provide a link to anything to provide a reference for this. Like that, they could have at least done that. I can't really excuse this. Like this is what makes this article so garbage, and this is kind of like that subtle bias that I think a lot of people pick up on but don't really know how to put their finger on it. Now, we have two views on what these voting rules are. On one side, you have Republicans who view these rules as part of an election integrity bill. On the other side, you have Democrats that would call these rules voting restrictions. Now, they can both be true, but they definitely have connotations to them that impact how you view them. If you call it an election integrity bill, you're trying to present this in a positive light. If you call them voting restrictions, you're trying to present them in a negative light. So how does a so-called straight news article try to contextualize them? Now, I would hope it would try to avoid either versions of this terminology, but Reuters definitely chooses one of them, and it characterizes them mainly as voting restrictions, with like one exception in which they acknowledge the Republicans' view that these are election integrity measures. So let me just show you the 4 examples and tell you how I think you could, if you're trying to not be biased, rewrite them. And I argue that it's not that difficult. So the first one, we'll go back to the main line I read earlier. The state already has some of the most stringent voting laws in the country, according to election experts. You could have written this as some election experts, such as, then name somebody, accuse the state of having some of the most stringent voting laws in the country. You're no longer presenting this line as a fact, and they're showing that people have an opinion that it's the most stringent voting laws. Likewise, in the line that says, a state House Representatives Committee on Thursday was holding a hearing on a companion bill that would impose other voting restrictions, you could have avoided using that terminology and instead said, include other changes to the voting process. Again, important if your goal is to try to present news as unbiased as possible. Third, Texas appeared on Thursday to become the next flashpoint on politically charged issues in corporate America after legislation passed by the state Senate to limit voting access, again, biased language there, prompted a rebuke from American Airlines. You could have changed that part, the limit the voting access, to after legislation regarding voting rules passed by the state Senate prompted a rebuke from American Airlines. You include all that stuff without having to show any sort of biasness in the situation. Finally, the comments by American and Southwest came after Atlanta-based Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola on Wednesday joined a growing number of companies that challenged the state of Georgia's new voting restrictions. Again, you didn't have to do that. If you were trying to be unbiased, you could have wrote that challenged the state of Georgia's new voting rules and let the reader decide if these are voting restrictions or election integrity measures. provide more information. But instead, this article front loaded a lot of the characterization and then didn't include a lot of details that lets the reader decide on their own what is and isn't the best way to characterize this bill. I hope you enjoyed the breakdown of this article, and I hope you learned a little more on this Texas bill. Do you agree that the bill's changes should be considered voting restrictions, or do you think they are necessary election integrity measures first and foremost? Drop a comment below and let me know. This is Have News Will Read, and I'll see you next time.